In this lecture, we're going to be going over the general arthropod body plan and then looking at the external anatomy of ticks, scorpions, spiders, and insects. With insects, we'll also look in more detail at the structure of the antennae, mouth parts, thorax, and specialized appendages. The picture on this title slide is actually a macro or macroscopic shot of the scales on the wings of an emerald swallowtail, Papilio palinurus. This is not a species of medical importance, but it is a structural phenomenon that we refer to as physical or structural coloration, where the colors that we're seeing are not the result of a pigment, but actually due to the refraction, diffraction, the scattering of light itself. There are two major branches or lineages of arthropods that are differentiated based on their mouth parts. The oldest branch, the first to diverge from that ancestral arthropod, were the chelicerates. Chelicerates include sea spiders, horseshoe crabs, and are arachnids. And of medical importance, we're only considering the arachnids Acari, which is it's a polyphyletic group, but that includes that order Exotidae, the ticks, as well as mites. We also consider Scorpiones, the scorpions, Araneae, the spiders, and then there's some other groups of typically non-medical importance, like harvestmen or daddy longlegs, which are Apiliones. There's pseudoscorpions. There's sun spiders, which actually do have some medical importance, but we're not going to really talk about them. Whip spiders and whip scorpions. So variety of different groups there. I don't want to discount the diversity of chelicerates, but only kind of considering that one branch right now, that one terminal node on this tree. The other branch, which we do see split into three in this phylogenetic tree, are the mandibulates. So mandibulates include the myriapods, so centipedes and millipedes, as well as what we call pancrustacea, which is crustacea, the crustaceans, and the hexapods, including insecta, the insects. So with our first major branch there, the chelicerates, what defines them are these chelicerae, which are pincher-like appendages that arise before the mouth. And these chelicerae can be pretty highly modified in some groups. In spiders, they are equipped with fangs. Another important characteristic for these chelicerates is a pair of pedipalps, which are located then right behind the mouth. So the pedipalps are sensory, or they're sort of modified organs, which literally means like foot hands. And they're used to capture, to handle different kinds of prey. In scorpions, they're modified into the chili, those big pinchers. And in adult male spiders, the tips of the pedipalps are actually kind of ballooned out or bulbous, and they're used to transfer sperm to the female spiders during mating. And then when we consider just the overall body plan, we want to consider the tagmatization, which is just these major body segments that we have. So with our chelicerates, we have two tagmata. We have a prosoma and we have an opistosoma. So that's the cephalothorax and the abdomen. In Acari, the ticks and mites, those two tagmata are effectively fused into one. There's no differentiation between the two. Now, in mandibulates, we're now looking at that other big branch on this tree, very diverse branch, of course, containing the insects as well as crustacea, a very diverse group too. They're characterized by having mandibles. So mandibles are these jaw-like structures that are used for food processing. They're often heavily sclerotized, very tough, and great for grinding and otherwise processing food. Another important aspect of this group are the antennae. So the antennae are sensory appendages. Crustaceans have a pair of antennae. Insects have a pair of pairs of antennae. Insects have a single pair of antennae. And then we'll see them of these structures on millipedes and centipedes too, of course. Now, as far as tagmatization goes, it does vary based on the group, with myriapods and crustaceans effectively having two tagmata, with various sorts of terminology and names associated with them that we don't need to concern ourselves with too much. Besides, I would say maybe myriapods, which can have medical importance, broken into the head and the trunk. And then we have in insects 3 tagmata: head, thorax, and abdomen. Now, before we get too far into details of external anatomy, I want to review some key anatomical terms referring to the different kinds of planes we will draw through the axis of an animal, and then directional terms as well, because I will often use these terms and I want to make sure we know what each of these terms mean. Now, yes, this is a picture of a goat here, but I would argue, for the purpose of this lecture, that goats have jointed legs, and arthropod literally means jointed legs, so we can, for now, consider him to be an honorary arthropod. So there are 3 major planes we can draw through the axis of a bilaterally symmetrical, right? One of these symmetrical animals like this. The first plane we'll draw is the sagittal plane, and this plane simply divides the organism into left and right halves. The next plane we'll draw is the frontal plane, and the frontal plane separates the organism into dorsal, or like back, and ventral, or belly halves. Now, this plane can be a little bit tricky to keep straight just because humans, us, we're bipedal. We stand upright on 2 feet, so our frontal and dorsal is not in the same orientation as most animals would have their frontal and dorsal. Finally, we have the transverse plane, and this divides an animal into anterior and posterior halves, with anterior being nearer the head and posterior being nearer the tail. It's these 2 planes, frontal and transverse, that are flipped in humans since we're standing upright on 2 feet. So just perspective-wise, kind of have to imagine us down on all 4s. Now, directional terms. A few sets of directional terms here, and my caution would be that these terms are always in reference to some other location. So they're descriptive adjectives, really, and they do need some context if you are going to use them. So the first pair we're going to look at are superior and inferior. And this just refers to the location in reference to the head. If we're closer to the head, we would say that this feature, this anatomical feature, is superior. Or if we're further away from the head, that feature is inferior then. Another pair is lateral versus medial. And this just refers to how close that feature is to the midline or to the sagittal plane. If you could kind of imagine not drawing a plane through an animal, but literally just running a string through that axis, perpendicular to transverse, just all the way through that axis, we are going to have lateral and medial. So if we're close to the midline, then we would say this is a medial structure, or if we're lateral, then we're like out to the sides, right? Lateral would be out to the sides. Then we have proximal and distal, and this refers to location nearest to the trunk. So proximal would be nearer to the trunk, that's center body mass, and distal would be farther out. Like, for example, your finger bones are distal to your elbow, right? They are farther out from the trunk. And then we have the last pair here, superficial versus deep, and this is now, that reference point is going to be the surface of the animal's body. And superficial means close to the surface, and deep is going to be actually deeper inside, closer to the midline or wherever, just below the surface, just further and further from that surface. So now we're going to continue, and we're going to look at the anatomy of the different major groups of orders, and then with ticks and mites, we'll include mites as well. So we're going to look at the anatomy of this black-legged tick, which belongs to Ixodidae, the order Ixodidae, as kind of our representative now for this ticks and mites category of medically relevant arthropods. The first thing I would like to draw your attention to is just how the body is divided up. Like I said, our arachnids, chelicerates in general, they're going to have 2 tagmata, but these tagmata are fused together in ticks and mites. However, we'll still differentiate 2 regions of the body. First, we have the gnathosoma, which just means like it's the mouth part of the body. And then we have the idiosoma, which is just the body part of the body here. Now, the gnathosoma consists of, in the ticks, we've got ticks and mites, a capitulum, which is going to be this projected area that contains the specialized mouth parts here. And we'll see that the capitulum consists of these palps. So these are the palps right here on the outside. So that's lateral. And then interior here, you're going to see the chelicera. Now, we have already looked at a picture of the mouth parts of a tick under a scanning electron microscope in a previous lecture, and you'll remember that there's that very spiky, long hypostome, and that's barbed, and that's used to help anchor the animal into its host, and that is something that you cannot see from this dorsal view. If we were to flip the tick upside down, we could see that hypostome, or if the tick was to just relax its mouth parts a little bit, we would be able to see that hypostome in between the paired chelicerae, in between the paired palps. It's kind of fun to say, paired palps. Another major part of the organism's body in the ticks, we're going to see this sort of hardened plate called the scutum. And then the last sorts of features I want to draw your attention to is just how the leg segmentation is, because we're going to see differences in leg segmentation among all of the orders that we're talking about here, from Ixodida, the ticks, to the scorpions, to the spiders, to the insects. We're going to see differences in leg segmentation. So the trochanter is the first segment that we see here, but the actual sort of hip, if you were to call it one, is not visible from dorsal view. We would have to flip the tick upside down again to see the actual first segment of the leg, which is called the coxa. But so after the coxa, we've got the trochanter, we have the femur, we have this, in spiders, we have a segment here called the patella. It's a legitimate kneecap in the spiders. In ticks, it's called a genu. Then we have the tibia, and then the tarsus, and the pretarsus, which will contain a little claw. It's like the fingers in a way. So all of these segments are relatively equal in length in these organisms here, but when we look at some of the other groups, we're going to see some differences in lengths of these leg segments. So in this case, it's just kind of just counting down until you've seen the correct number of leg segments. Moving on to scorpions, again, we'll look at this separation of the body first. Being chelicerates, being arachnids, we're going to see those two tagmata. In this case, right, the prosoma and the opistosoma. So cephalothorax and abdomen. Now, because of how scorpions have a very specialized tail-like region, that's just a modification of the abdomen, we will also divide scorpions, we'll subdivide them into the mesosoma, which is the middle, meso means middle. And this is actually the pre-abdomen, and then we've got the metasoma, which is going to be the post-abdomen. So pro, meso, and meta. And when we see pro, meso, and meta like this, it does mean like first, second, and first, middle, and last. And we're going to see those terms used again when we describe insect segmentation, in particular in the thorax, where we have 3 sections to the insect thorax, and we need to differentiate between things, between appendages that are attached to each of those segments. So pro, meso, and meta, just kind of keep those words fresh in your head for now. You'll notice that there's kind of a lot more anatomy to be looking at. What will probably draw your eye first with the scorpions, of course, is either the pinchers or the sting. As humans, we're adapted to recognize danger easily, and these certainly seem to be the bitey and stinging ends of this organism. So the last abdominal segment, or two, I don't recall offhand in terms of developmental biology exactly how this structure is formed, but this last section is called the telson, and the sting itself is called the aculeus. Now, if we're going to look at the front pinchy end of the scorpion, the chela refers to this pincher itself. It's composed of 2 segments here, actually, in this appendage. So there's kind of a thumb and a hand that are going to be operating there with some musculature for the pinching. And this whole structure, these pinchers, are just pedipalps. That's all that they are. They're very expanded, very elaborate pedipalps. So we'll see the chelicerae then in between them, nice and clear. With scorpions, we do have eyes in a rather unusual kind of orientation, where we have lateral eyes out here on the edges. Remember that when we're using these terms like medial or lateral, we're going to see those terms right here now describing the eyes, the lateral eyes, or we're going to see a pair of they're called median eyes, but this would be medial if we wanted to throw out that kind of anatomical direction term. And then this sort of hardened plate here covering this first section is called the carapace. And carapace, very common sort of structure. We'll see various versions of it in different groups. And then, just to review sections of the leg, we're going to see very similar sections. The only real difference now is that the genu that we saw in Akari is now called a patella, and that is going to be something that we see continue over to spiders, where this segment here is going to be called the patella, between the femur, between the tibia, exactly the same as human bones, by the way, femur, patella, tibia. It's sort of like a kneecap. I mean, it's not really a knee, it's just an extra joint in these jointed legs, but we're seeing that same orientation there. So the coxa is going to be the sort of hip section, that movable hip section, the first segment to one of these segmented legs. Then we have the trochanter, femur, patella, tibia, and the tarsus. And in scorpions here, we will see very clearly that the tarsus is comprised of two segments. They are referred to as a basotarsus and telotarsus, which just means like the base part and then the far part of the tarsus. And I won't ask you to differentiate between those two terms, just collectively calling this the tarsus is sufficient, but to remember that that's going to be two segments. So if you're counting up segments from the foot, if you're counting up segments from the very end, just remember that there's two right away. Otherwise, if you're counting from here, if you're going coxa, trochanter, if you memorize them in order, just make sure that you keep the number of segments straight. Now, spiders. So with spiders, we will again continue our theme of looking at the tagmatization. The two tagmata first, the cephalothorax or the prosoma, and the abdomen or the opistosoma. So we're already seeing this major division, that tagmatization of the body. We are going to look right away at the pedipalps and the chelicerae. So the pedipalps, a little bit smaller here. Remember, in male spiders, adult male spiders, they will be kind of swollen bulbous at the end because they're involved in reproduction, sperm transfer to the female spiders. This is a picture of a female spider here, so they look more tapered. And then the chelicerae are going to be kind of small in front there. So I've got a picture, kind of a front view looking at the face. This is a very different group of spider, but it's a great example of just seeing these chelicerae then equipped with those fangs. This is a picture of brown widow spider, I believe it looks like a brown widow spider is what I chose to include for this one. But this is a very different group here. Okay, and then a couple of things. Let's see, what do we want to look at first? I think a leg segmentation. So as far as the segmentation goes, the first segment we can really make out here, we can see actually the trochanter is very small, right closest to the body. It was too small really for me to add that label in, so I just started with the femur, which can be a very long, obvious leg segment. We've got the patella here, which in spiders is a lot shorter than the femur and the tibia for sure, so it will look a little bit more like that kneecap that we're sort of thinking about. The tibia is going to be a long segment, and then here we see the tarsus is also quite long. If we flip the spider over here, we're looking now at the ventral side instead of this dorsal side. Then we can make out the actual coxa, the trochanter, and we'll see that femur take off before we kind of leave this little viewing window right here. So thinking about just which leg segment comes after which, in all the groups we've looked at so far, it is always coxa, trochanter, femur, then it's either genu or patella, and then tibia and tarsus. And the tip of the tarsus is often called the pretarsus. Sometimes you may see that specifically, like in insects. We'll definitely be considering that one very uniquely. That's where we have the foot pad, that's where we have the claws that are not like fighting velociraptor claws, they're just for grip and walking along on different surfaces. So when we're looking at the ventral side of the spider, there's a couple of other things to point out as well. You're going to see in this kind of fold right here, there's going to be two openings on either side. Those are the openings to the book lungs, which are part of the respiratory, the gas exchange system. They're kind of like sort of a weird hybrid between gills and lungs in their own way. But this is going to be part of that unique respiratory system for the spiders. In female spiders, we're going to see another opening here called the epigyne, and then on the very sort of this apical part of the abdomen, we're going to see the spinnerets, and the spinnerets are going to be connected to some interior glands that are going to produce the web, and that web does come out as a liquid that hardens on contact with air. One other thing to point out, I'm not going to expect anybody to memorize the orientation of the eyes, but we do have posterior and anterior eyes. So there's sort of a front row and a back row in terms of the eyes, and the actual orientation and size of these 8 eyes is used to identify different families of spiders, or it's just one of the traits that can be very useful in identifying different families of spiders. So this is more of an FYI at this point. Some of you may be very motivated to be identifying some spiders down to the level of family, but I think that probably goes outside of the scope of this class. We just need to be able to recognize a few medically important species, not necessarily making these sort of broader family level IDs. And our last order now is Insecta, the insects, and we'll look at those tagmata first. We have 3 tagmata: the head, we have the thorax. Actually, you've got to expand that out here. The thorax comprises this section, and then we have the abdomen here. So you'll notice that the legs are only attached to the thorax. We have a pro, meso, and metathoracic segment comprising this entire thorax. The prothorax has a foreleg, the mesothorax has the midleg, and the metathorax has the hind leg. And in winged insects, there are 2 pairs of wings, and these wings are attached to the meso and metathorax. So collectively, sometimes the meso and metathorax are called the pterothorax. Ptero meaning wings. This is the flight portion of the thorax. Another term I wanted to throw out right away as well is going to be that the hardened plates that you're seeing on either the dorsal or those ventral surfaces, or even some of these lateral plates that you might see here on the thorax, are called sclerites. If they're dorsal, we call them tergites, and if they're ventral, we call them sternites. Between these plates, there is soft cuticle flexible arthroidal membrane. And in some insects, the plates may be relatively soft or harder, and this can affect just the overall structure of the insect and whether it can kind of like expand out as it continues to eat, or if it needs to be very mobile or bendy or something like that. So there's a lot of different features to be pointing out on the insects. I'm going to start by pointing out the mandibulate mouth parts here. We can see this is actually part of the mandible. We'll look at the mouth parts in much more detail here, but we're going to see the mandible. We're going to see that there are actually 2 pairs of palps. There'll be 2 pairs of palps. We're only seeing one of them here, but there'll be 2 pairs of palps. The eye, there'll be simple eyes, the ocelli, often in a triangular orientation on the top of the head. We've got the antenna for sensation. Spiracles, so they will see spiracles on the thorax and on the abdomen, and these spiracles open into the tracheal system of the insect, and this is the system for gas exchange. So these trachea are branching tubes, not unlike our own trachea, but instead of getting smaller and smaller and just ending in the alveoli of the lungs, these trachea end in very small tracheoles, which will then connect actually to different regions of tissue, and sometimes even specific cells, piping air directly through the entire body. Looking at the segments of the leg, as we typically do, we're going to see, unlabeled here is going to be the coxa and the trochanter. They're a little bit hard to make out in this diagram, but then we'll see that nice large femur, and then we'll see a tibia. So there's no segment between the femur and the tibia for insects. There's no patella. So that expression, the bee's knees, would be much more anatomically accurate if we were to say something like the spider's knees, because spiders have knees, bees do not. Femur, tibia, and then there'll be a multi-segmented tarsus, and depending on the group of insects we're looking at, there could be 3, 5, 6, there could be a number of different segments to that tarsus, and then the very sort of last articulated component we call the pretarsus, which is going to be equipped with a little foot pad, typically, and claw. The ovipositor is going to be the female anatomical feature for laying eggs. In grasshoppers, it comprises these sort of valves. In aculeate Hymenoptera, so that's the stinging ones, it's modified into a sting. And I think the last feature I wanted to point out here before we move on is this large plate here, which in the past we might have called a carapace, but what this is it's just one nice big segment on the prothorax, and this is called the pronotum. Now, we're going to look at the structure, the anatomy of the insects in more detail now. We're going to look at that thorax again. We're going to look at the legs again and the mouth parts and the wings in more detail. We'll start. First, the antennae. So insects use their antennae to sense their environment. And there's sensory cells called sensilla that are present in hairs and in pits on these antennae themselves. And these sorts of stimuli they can detect are involved in chemoreception, so smells, tastes, mechanoreception, touch, physical stimuli, and thermoreception, which is temperature. There's also, you might consider proprioception, which is orientation of self. There's some specialized sensory cells we'll talk about in a second that are involved in just detecting air vibration, this orientation of the antennae, how the antennae might be vibrating in response to air vibration or something like that. So the overall structure of this antennae, it's going to start out with the scape, which is kind of typically a longer first segment, this sort of stalk, and then the second segment is called the pedicel. This holds Johnston's organ, and Johnston's organ just has a sort of collection of specialized sensory cells that are detecting motion, often species-specific air vibrations, wing beats, like in midges. They can identify, they know if it's one of their friends, if the frequency of wing beats in the air is a certain high pitch. It's amazing. It is actually quite incredible, this kind of detection and specialization in some of these cells. And then the remainder of the antenna is called the flagellum, and it's made up of many flagellomeres. And this is going to be adapted in different species. We're going to see different kind of styles of antennae, and the styles of antennae I think that we're most likely to encounter in medical entomology are the 5 that I have listed here. So we have filiform antennae, and filiform antennae, what they are is, these are also called thread-like antennae. So they're thread-like antennae, they're going to be multi-segmented, and they kind of maintain this standard diameter throughout the entire antennae. I mean, they may be a little bit wider in these basal segments, but throughout that entire antennae, it's relatively it can be very long, and it'll be very kind of thin and thread-like. Now, in this picture, we see many kind of segments of relatively equal, almost kind of roundish segments here. Hemiptera, our true bugs, also have filiform antennae, but they often have kind of like few elongate segments. So they may only have like 4 or 5 segments to the antenna, or at least 4 or 5 segments past the 4 or 5 segments in the flagellum, but that these segments are going to be very long individually. Stylate antennae. Stylate antennae is something that we would see in, for example, horseflies and deerflies have stylate antennae. Aristate antennae are common in houseflies and in blowflies and other related groups there. And those aristate antennae have an arista, which is this kind of very small bristle on that arista. The stylate antennae aren't quite bristle-like that. And then there's geniculate or elbowed antennae. This is pretty common in ants and other Hymenoptera. And then plumose antennae. Plumose antennae have a lot of surface area there. Often, like male mosquitoes have extremely plumose antennae, which just has a huge amount of increased surface area to detect female pheromones. Looking now at the mouth parts. So insects have ectognathous mouth parts, which just means the mouth parts project outside. They're mounted, they're projecting outside of the head. There's a number of structures to be familiar with: labrum, mandible, maxilla, and labium. So kind of keeping these in order is going to be the best way to learn them. So the labrum is the upper lip. This keeps food in the mouth. It protects some of the other mouth parts. It's just plate-like sclerites. And I like to remember this one, the labrum, by just thinking about like a mustache, like a broom mustache, a big broom mustache. Labrum sounds like broom to me. So it's kind of how I connect the dots there. Then we have the mandibles. These are highly sclerotized, typically really tough. They can be toothed. They're used for crushing, for grinding food. They move side to side along the frontal plane. And then in between the mandibles and the maxillae, right before we get to maxillae, we're going to see a tongue-like process, which is kind of more, I wouldn't say internal, but it's going to be hard to see. There's going to be this tongue-like process, mixing food, mixing saliva. It's located behind the mandibles. And then next we have the maxillae. So the maxillae are used to, they're involved in food manipulation, they're involved in sensation, and the maxillae are equipped with a pair of palps. So they're called the maxillary palps. And then finally we have the labium. So the labium, these are two fused appendages that kind of form the lower lip or the floor of the mouth, and they also host a pair of palps called the labial palps. Now, the mouth parts, except for the mandibles, there's a lot of chemoreceptors and kind of tactile, physically stimulated hairs and sensory structures all over the mouth. So the antennae are very sensitive to different sensations. So mouth parts too, especially the palps, the labial palps for sure. The maxillary palps a little bit less so. They're more for handling food, but there's a lot of sensory structures around the mouth as well. So insects can most certainly taste things not just with their antennae, but with their mouth parts too. There's a variety of specialized mouth parts to be aware with, and these different specializations are really just to help promote sort of different sorts of feeding behaviors. We see different specializations in different groups. The default setting is chewing mouth parts, which we would say is mandibulate, right? This insects belong to this broader group of arthropods called the mandibulates. So we have mandibles, nice sort of standard chewing mouth parts there. But in other groups, the mandibles, the maxillae are modified. Maybe they're modified into very long stylate piercing structures, or they're modified into sponging structures or something like that. So in butterflies and moths, we see siphoning mouth parts, so they have this long coiled proboscis. In bees, we have chewing lapping mouth parts. So they do still have some pretty tough mandibles, but then their labia, their maxillae here, they're actually quite modified into this long tongue. Certain flies have sponging mouth parts. A lot of flies have sponging mouth parts, typically Brachycera. These are just the higher flies. So think house flies, think blowflies, and related groups. A couple of other groups I suppose in there as well, but house flies, flesh flies, blowflies, the groups, a number of groups we'll be talking about a lot for their medical importance. Hemiptera have a beak, these piercing, sucking mouth parts. So in this case, their mouth parts are modified in a number of different stylates around with this protective sheath. Very similar actually to mosquitoes, although these piercing, sucking mouth parts have evolved independently in both of these two groups. Mosquitoes also have piercing, sucking mouth parts. Structure is a little bit different, but the structures are very similar, but what I mean to say is that they're homoplastic. It's just stuff that's happened through convergent evolution. And there's a number of other different modifications. These are the major ones, but for medical entomology, I think the last one worth mentioning is going to be the cutting, lapping mouth parts that we have in tabanids. So in tabanids, these are our horseflies and our deer flies, pretty intense guys here, and what they do is they are able to lacerate with some very hard, sharp mouth parts, and then to sponge up, to lap up the blood that they free from their unfortunate little blood hosts. Next, the thorax, which functions primarily in locomotion, with 3 pairs of walking legs, the fore, the mid, and the hind legs. The forelegs are attached to the prothorax, the mid legs are attached to the middle mesothorax, and the hind legs are attached to the metathorax. Pro, meso, meta. Important terms to keep straight, to keep in order there. Then there's 2 pairs of wings, and these wings are going to be attached, if present, to the meso and metathorax. So combined, the meso and the metathorax may be called the pterothorax in some of the winged insects. If we consider the pronotum, the dorsal sclerite of the prothorax, so this is what we're seeing in the cockroach here, that's the dorsal sclerite or the tergite, and it's often kind of enlarged and carapace-like. In some groups of insects, it's highly ornamental. In others, it's just kind of just broad and carapace-like. So that's called the pronotum. And then in another few groups of insects, a notable plate is going to be this mesothoracic sclerite, which is enlarged, shield-shaped, called the scutellum in true bugs, for example. Looking at the legs specifically, to review, we have that prothorax equipped with 4 legs, the mesothorax with the mid legs, and the metathorax with the hind legs. And when we look at the segmentation, it's going to be coxa, which is kind of like the hip in a way, the trochanter, then the femur, tibia, and multi-segmented tarsus. So the tarsus is going to be comprised of tarsomeres, and the very first tarsomere can sometimes be a little bit bigger, broader than the rest. It may be called the basitarsus, but we're going to see that multi-segmented tarsus, and then the sort of claw and the foot pad is going to combine to be called that pretarsus. So here's an up-close view here where we're looking at this the aerolium, which is part of this foot pad, and these claws, which are just used for walking along on various surfaces. Each tarsomere will be equipped with one of these adhesive foot pads. I think that there is a little bit of variation in their structure, and actually they may even be absent in some groups as well, but this just the standard body plan, we can expect to see that. And that pretarsus specifically, right, it is an extension of that last tarsomere, and it contains these structures. As with the mouth parts, the legs are often highly specialized for different ecologies, adapted for various forms of locomotion, for capturing prey, or other variety of other functions. So modifications to the sort of default walking leg of insects. The first is elongated, slender legs for running. We call these cursorial legs, and cockroaches, great example of cursorial legs. Long, slender, adapted for speed. Raptorial legs are grasping legs, and we see grasping legs in a variety of different groups. In this picture, it's actually not a praying mantis. This is a mantispid, a mantid fly. So it is unrelated to praying mantises, but does look very similar to a praying mantis. Other groups with raptorial legs include some assassin bugs and include, of course, real praying mantises as well. So those grasping legs are especially well adapted for capturing prey. Saltatorial legs, these are legs for jumping. With this being a medical entomology class, I should have perhaps swapped out the picture of the grasshopper for a flea, but I'll leave my grasshopper picture for now because, of course, this is just a general entomology lecture as it is. Fossorial legs are for digging. This is a picture of a mole cricket, and its front legs are quite broad, and it does have some pretty tough, hardened projections on its sort of hind tibia and in its tarsal region for digging. And then natatorial legs. These are legs often with kind of a broad, flatter surface, oar-like, or with many fine hairs to increase the surface area used for swimming. Now, I don't have a separate slide on wings themselves. I just want to jump into wing modifications. So as with the legs, as with the mouth parts, we often see different adaptations, the most common being protection of the wings themselves. So wings are delicate. Wings are delicate membranous structures, so it is common to see some of the wings. You see the forewings modified in a way to protect those hind wings. The first modification we'll see are called tegmina. So tegmina is just a sort of a leathery, a thickening of the wing overall. So tegmina are these leathery, thickened forewings. We see those in crickets and grasshoppers. We see them in earwigs. We see them in cockroaches. We see them in praying mantises. They all have tegmina. So those forewings are leathery. Elytra, this refers to the hard shells of beetles. Those hard shells, those are the forewings. They are just very tough. They are extremely tough, shell-like, and they are incredible for protection. So those are elytra. True bugs have something called hemelytra, which means half shells. So it's only the basal portion of those forewings that is hardened like that. And this right here, I'm going to highlight this. This is that basal part of the forewing. This is the membranous part of the forewing, so that apical membranous part there. And then this right here is the hind wing. So it does kind of look like they're overlapping a little bit here. I just want to make sure it's clear where we can see the forewing is this part here, and then the hind wing is right kind of behind it in this photo. And then the last modification to consider are halteres. And these are such an extreme modification that we don't even really consider them to be wings anymore. Diptera, so this is the order that contains flies, Diptera literally means diptera, two wings. Instead of two pairs of wings, just two wings. And two wings, very, very useful defining feature for this group, with those hind wings being modified into these knob-like structures called halteres. And they are used as stabilizing organs that help improve flight control. So flies are great at flying thanks to this adaptation. And then very finally, the last slide in this lecture is about the functions of the abdomen, which are lots of body stuff. Respiration, excretion, reproduction, digestion, I mean lots and lots of body stuff going on in the abdomen. Now, appendages are usually reduced or absent. Everything we've been talking about so far, these specializations, are all about appendages. The mouth parts are appendages on the head, very adapted. The legs, I think, are obviously appendages. The wings are appendages. But with the abdomen, we typically don't see appendages at all. But there's a few exceptions. So the first would be cerci. So cerci are appendages used for sensation, detecting air currents. They're these sort of almost kind of lateral extensions off that apical part of the abdomen there. And we'll see them in grasshoppers, crickets. Grasshoppers are very short cerci. Crickets have very nice long cerci. And we'll also see them in cockroaches, for example. So just to be noticing that structure there. And then the other structure I wanted to draw your attention to, because we will talk about, I think, butterflies and moths in terms of some of them can cause some allergies with their urticating hairs and things. So I wanted to just draw your attention to the prolegs. So these are the prolegs. They are kind of like extensions of the abdomen in a way. They are not true legs. They're not jointed legs, but they are still these kind of abdominal appendages right there. The true jointed legs we'll see up here connected to the thorax. So that is everything for today. Join me next time. Looking forward to whatever our next topic may be.